Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. Gary Richardson stood in his garage workshop, methodically cleaning his tools after another successful furniture restoration project. The smell of wood stain and varnish filled the air, scents that had become as familiar as his morning coffee. At 34, Gary had built Richardson Custom Woodworks from nothing into a thriving business that served the wealthy suburbs of Denver. More importantly, it provided the perfect cover for his other skills he'd acquired during 8 years as an Army Ranger before returning home to civilian life. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Becky. Tamara called. "She sounds awful again. Can you check on her after work?" Gary frowned, wiping his hands on a rag. His sister-in-law, Tamara Richardson, had been struggling with what doctors called a mysterious autoimmune condition for the past 3 months. The woman who once ran marathons and managed a successful real estate office now barely had energy to care for a 5-year-old daughter, Christy. His brother David had died in a car accident 2 years ago, leaving Tamara to raise Christy alone until this illness started consuming her life. Setting down his tools, Gary locked up the workshop and drove his black Ford F-150 across town to Tamara's house in the upscale Highlands neighborhood. The Tudor-style home that David had saved years to buy still looked immaculate from the outside, but Gary knew the struggle happening within. He knocked gently before using a spare key. "Tamara? It's Gary. Uncle Gary." Christy's voice echoed from the living room, where she sat cross-legged in front of a coloring book, her dark hair in pigtails. Despite everything, the little girl maintained her bright spirit, a trait she'd inherited from her father. "Hey, sweetheart, where's Mommy?" "Upstairs sleeping again. She's been sleeping a lot." Christy's voice carried a maturity that broke Gary's heart. No 5-year-old should have to navigate this kind of uncertainty. Gary found Tamara in her bedroom, looking gaunt and pale against the white pillows. When David was alive, she'd been vibrant and energetic, with striking blonde hair and an infectious laugh. Now she appeared to be wasting away, her once athletic frame reduced to skin and bones. "Gary," she opened her eyes, struggling to focus. "I didn't hear you come in. How are you feeling today?" "Worse." She attempted to sit up but fell back against the pillows, exhausted. "The doctors want to run more tests, but I can barely make it to the bathroom, let alone the hospital." "And Christy," her voice broke. "She shouldn't have to see me like this." Gary sat on the edge of the bed, his trained eye automatically scanning for anything unusual. 3 months of this mysterious illness, and no doctor could provide answers beyond vague autoimmune theories and endless prescriptions that seemed to make everything worse. "What about that new friend of yours, Lorenzo? Has he been helping out?" A strange expression crossed Tamara's face, fear mixed with something else Gary couldn't identify. "Lorenzo's been attentive, maybe too attentive. Sometimes I think." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Never mind. I'm probably just paranoid from all the medication." "What were you going to say?" "It's nothing. Just forget it." But her eyes told a different story, and Gary filed away her reaction for later consideration. Downstairs, Christy had abandoned her coloring book and was now building something elaborate with Legos. "Uncle Gary, want to see my castle? It has a secret dungeon where bad guys get trapped." "That's pretty clever, Christy. How do you trap the bad guys?" "With hidden doors and tricks. Once they go in, they can't get out." She demonstrated with a small plastic figure, showing how her construction would spring a trap. "Daddy taught me that sometimes you have to be smarter than the bad guys." The innocence in her voice contrasted sharply with the sophisticated trap she'd built. David had been teaching her about problem-solving and critical thinking, lessons that might prove more valuable than either of them had realized. After ensuring Tamara had eaten something and Christy was settled for the evening, Gary returned home to his own house in Lakewood. Becky was waiting in the kitchen, her red hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing scrubs from her shift at Denver General Hospital. "How is she?" Becky asked, wrapping her arms around him. "Getting worse. And there's something she's not telling us about this Lorenzo character." Becky stepped back, studying his face. After 6 years of marriage, She could read his expressions like a roadmap. You think he's involved somehow? I think a healthy 31-year-old woman doesn't just start wasting away for no reason. And I think the timing of this new boyfriend is suspicious. Gary, you can't start investigating every man Tamara dates just because you're protective. She's been alone for 2 years. It's natural that she'd want companionship. But something in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments, was sending up warning signals. Lorenzo Hughes had appeared in Tamara's life just weeks before her mysterious illness began. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, had unlimited flexibility in his schedule, and seemed unusually eager to help with Christie's care. In the Army, Gary had learned to trust his instincts above all else. Those instincts had helped him identify IED patterns, locate enemy positions, and survive situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Now those same instincts were screaming that something was very wrong with the picture-perfect boyfriend who'd inserted himself into a vulnerable woman's life. That night, as Becky slept beside him, Gary stared at the ceiling and made a decision. If the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with Tamara, he'd start conducting his own investigation. He'd learned patience and methodical planning in the military, and he'd learned precision and attention to detail in his woodworking business. Combined, those skills made him uniquely qualified to uncover whatever truth was hiding beneath the surface of Lorenzo Hughes's helpful exterior. Tomorrow, he'd begin watching and waiting. In his experience, predators always revealed themselves eventually. You just had to know how to look. Chapter 2, Shadows of Doubt. 2 weeks later, Gary had established a careful surveillance routine. His woodworking business gave him the flexibility to adjust his schedule, and his workshop's location provided a clear view of the route to Tamara's house. He'd begun documenting Lorenzo Hughes's patterns, and what he discovered made his blood run cold. Lorenzo Hughes was a handsome man in his late 30s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of smile that charmed hospital staff and teachers alike. He drove a pristine white BMW and dressed in expensive suits that suggested his pharmaceutical sales job was extremely lucrative. On the surface, he appeared to be the perfect partner for a struggling single mother. But Gary's investigation had uncovered disturbing inconsistencies. The pharmaceutical company Lorenzo claimed to work for had no record of him as an employee. His background prior to arriving in Denver 18 months ago was virtually non-existent. Most troubling of all, Gary had tracked down 2 other women in nearby cities who had died under similar mysterious circumstances. Both had been involved with men matching Lorenzo's description in the months before their deaths. "You need to see this," Jeff Loomis said, sliding a manila folder across the table at their usual coffee shop. Jeff had been Gary's friend since high school and now worked as a detective with the Denver Police Department. His willingness to run unofficial background checks had always been invaluable, but this time his expression carried unprecedented gravity. Inside the folder were police reports from Boulder and Colorado Springs. Sarah Martinez, 29, died 6 months ago from an unknown autoimmune condition. Rebecca Chun, 33, died 8 months ago from a similar mysterious illness. Both women had young children. Both had been dating men who used different names, but shared Lorenzo's physical characteristics and modus operandi. "Jesus Christ," Gary whispered, studying the photographs. "How is this bastard not in prison?" "Because he's smart," Jeff replied grimly. "Different names, different stories, and he never stays in one place long enough to establish a clear pattern. The deaths look natural. No toxicology screens show anything unusual because whatever he's using either metabolizes quickly or mimics natural disease progression." "What about the children?" "That's the really sick part." Sarah Martinez's 7-year-old son went into foster care. Rebecca Chin's daughter was adopted by relatives in California. Both kids apparently loved their mother's new boyfriend and were devastated when she died. The implications hit Gary like a physical blow. Lorenzo wasn't just killing these women. He was positioning himself to either gain access to their children or ensure they be removed from any potential protective family members. The pattern suggested someone with knowledge of both toxicology and child welfare systems. "We need to get Tamara away from him immediately," Gary said, but Jeff shook his head. With what evidence? Everything I just showed you is circumstantial. Different cities, different identities, and no concrete proof he's the same person. If we move too fast and we're wrong, we destroy an innocent man's life. If we move too fast and we're right, he disappears and surfaces somewhere else with a new identity. So what do you suggest? We let him finish killing my sister-in-law. We build a case, carefully and methodically. Get concrete evidence that will hold up in court and put this bastard away forever. That evening, Gary arrived at Tamara's house to find Lorenzo's BMW in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, he could see the man preparing what appeared to be a special dinner. Christy sat at the breakfast bar, chattering animatedly, while Lorenzo smiled and nodded, occasionally responding with exaggerated enthusiasm. Gary used his key quietly, slipping in through the back door. The scene in the kitchen looked like a Norman Rockwell painting, caring boyfriend preparing a meal for his girlfriend's daughter while she recovered upstairs. But Gary's trained eye immediately noticed details that painted a different picture. Lorenzo was wearing latex gloves while cooking, unusual for someone preparing a casual family meal. A small pharmacy-style vial sat partially hidden behind the spice rack, and Lorenzo's movements had the precise, methodical quality of someone following a specific protocol rather than cooking intuitively. "Uncle Gary," Christy called out, spotting him in the doorway. "Lorenzo's making Mommy's special soup. It's supposed to help her feel better." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Gary replied, never taking his eyes off Lorenzo. "What kind of special ingredients are you using?" Lorenzo turned with that practiced smile, but for just a moment, Gary caught a flash of something cold and calculating in the man's eyes. "Just some herbal supplements that have helped other clients of mine. I work in pharmaceuticals, so I have access to some cutting-edge treatments that aren't widely available yet." "Experimental treatments?" Gary moved closer, noting how Lorenzo subtly shifted to block his view of the vial. "That's interesting. What company did you say you worked for again?" "Meridian Biotech. We specialize in autoimmune research." The lie came smoothly, but Gary had already confirmed that no such company existed in their databases. "And these supplements, are they FDA approved?" "They're imported from Switzerland. Different regulatory environment there, much more progressive about alternative treatments." Another lie, delivered with complete confidence. Christy tugged on Gary's sleeve. "Uncle Gary, can you help me give Mommy her soup? Lorenzo says I need to make sure she drinks all of it, because that's how medicine works." The innocent comment sent ice through Gary's veins. Whatever was in that soup, Lorenzo was ensuring a child would be the delivery method, creating psychological cover and making Tamara less likely to refuse. It was a level of manipulation that spoke to extensive experience and careful planning. "Actually, Christy, why don't we let Mommy rest a bit longer? Sometimes when people are really sick, they need extra sleep before they eat." Lorenzo's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, I think she should have it while it's warm. The bioactive compounds work better at optimal temperature." "Bioactive compounds." Gary stepped closer, using his 6'2" frame to establish subtle intimidation. "That sounds pretty technical for soup. I like to be precise about health matters." Lorenzo began ladling the soup into a bowl, his movements slightly faster now. "Tamara trusts me to help her get better." "I'm sure she does." Gary watched as Lorenzo's hands trembled almost imperceptibly while handling the ladle. Fear or excitement. Either way, it confirmed the man was operating under stress. "Christy, why don't you go upstairs and see if Mommy's awake?" As soon as the little girl left the room, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Lorenzo's friendly mask slipped, revealing something much more dangerous underneath. "You don't like me very much, do you, Gary?" "I don't like anyone who lies about their job, their background, and their intentions with my family." "Your family?" Lorenzo laughed, but held no warmth. "Tamara's not your blood, and Christy barely knows you exist half the time. You're the brother-in-law who shows up once a week to check boxes and feel good about himself." The insult was carefully chosen, designed to provoke an emotional reaction that would give Lorenzo tactical advantage. But Gary had faced far more skilled psychological warfare than this amateur could provide. You're right about one thing, Gary said calmly. I'm very protective of people I care about, and I have a particular talent for dealing with threats to those people. Something in his tone made Lorenzo take a step backward. The man had probably never encountered someone with actual combat experience. His victims had been vulnerable single mothers, not trained soldiers with the skills and mindset to fight back. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Lorenzo said, his voice losing some of its confidence. I'm only trying to help. I'm sure you are. The same way you helped Sarah Martinez in Boulder and Rebecca Chun in Colorado Springs. The color drained from Lorenzo's face. For several seconds, the only sound was the bubbling soup on the stove. Then Lorenzo's expression shifted again, this time to something that made Gary's hand instinctively move toward the knife block. You've been busy, Lorenzo said quietly, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. Then educate me. Some things are bigger than one sick woman and her daughter. Some things require sacrifice for the greater good. Before Gary could respond, Christy's voice called from upstairs, Uncle Gary, Mommy wants to see you. Lorenzo smiled again, but this time was purely predatory. We'll continue this conversation another time. Give Tamara my love. He walked out through the front door, leaving the soup cooling on the stove and taking the mysterious vial with him. Gary immediately turned off the burner and sealed the soup in a container for Jeff to analyze, knowing it likely contained whatever cocktail of substances was slowly killing Tamara. Upstairs, he found his sister-in-law looking worse than he'd ever seen her. Her skin had a grayish pallor, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Gary, she whispered, gripping his hand with surprising strength. I need to tell you something about Lorenzo. Something I should have said weeks ago. What is it? I found pills hidden in his car. Medical grade, in unmarked vials. And Christy, she paused, struggling for breath. Christy said she saw him putting something in my tea when he thought she wasn't looking. I didn't want to believe it, but now we know, Gary finished. Don't worry. I'm going to take care of this. Promise me something, Tamara whispered urgently. If something happens to me, don't let him near Christy. There's something wrong with him, something dangerous. He's been asking too many questions about her, about guardianship arrangements, about my will. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Lorenzo wasn't just killing these women for sport or financial gain. He was positioning himself to gain legal access to their children. Whether for his own sick purposes or as part of a larger operation, Gary couldn't yet determine. But the threat to Christy was immediate and real. Nothing's going to happen to you, he promised, though they both knew it might already be too late. But I need you to do exactly what I tell you from now on. No more food or drinks that Lorenzo brings. No more being alone with him. Can you do that? Tamara nodded weakly, then closed her eyes. I'm so tired, Gary. So very tired. As he sat beside her bed, watching the woman who'd become like a sister to him slowly waste away from a deliberately administered poison, Gary Richardson began planning for war. He'd spent 8 years learning how to identify, track, and eliminate threats to innocent people. Now those skills would serve a more personal mission. Lorenzo Hughes had made a critical error in targeting this particular family. He'd assumed he was dealing with another isolated, vulnerable single mother with no one capable of protecting her. Instead, he'd walked into the crosshairs of a man trained to fight monsters in human form. The hunting season was about to begin. Chapter 3: The Bloodstained Truth. 5 days later, on a gray October morning, Gary Richardson stood at the graveside as they lowered his sister-in-law into the ground. Despite his best efforts to intervene, Tamara had slipped away in her sleep 3 nights earlier. The official cause of death was listed as acute autoimmune failure, another victory for Lorenzo's careful methodology. Christy stood beside him in a small black dress, her tiny hand clutched in his as she watched them bury the only parent she had left. At 5 years old, she possessed an unsettling composure that reminded Gary of child soldiers he'd encountered overseas, too young to fully comprehend the horror they'd witnessed, but old enough to understand that everything safe and familiar had been destroyed. Lorenzo Hughes stood on the opposite side of the grave, playing his role as the grieving boyfriend to perfection. He'd even managed to produce tears, though Gary noticed they appeared and disappeared with suspicious timing. Several of Tamara's friends and colleagues approached him with condolences, praising his devotion during her final weeks. If Gary hadn't conducted his investigation, even he might have been fooled by the performance. The service concluded with Tamara's pastor offering words about finding peace in God's plan. Gary bit back the urge to mention that God's plan apparently included serial killers who targeted single mothers. Faith was a luxury he'd lost somewhere between his third combat deployment and watching his sister-in-law waste away from artificially induced illness. As the crowd began to disperse, Lorenzo approached with his practiced expression of sympathy. "Gary, I want you to know how much Tamara valued your support during her illness. She often mentioned how grateful she was to have you looking out for Christy. I'm sure she did. I've been thinking about Christy's future," Lorenzo continued, his voice carefully modulated to sound caring rather than calculating. "As someone who cared deeply for Tamara, I feel a responsibility to ensure Christy's well-being. I'd like to discuss guardianship arrangements." The audacity was breathtaking. 3 days after murdering the child's mother, he was positioning himself to gain legal control of his victim's daughter. Gary's military training kicked in, suppressing the rage that threatened to overwhelm his tactical thinking. "That's thoughtful of you, Lorenzo. But Christy will be staying with me and my wife. Of course, family comes first, but I hope you'll consider allowing me to maintain a relationship with her. She's grown quite attached to me, and I'd hate for her to lose another important person in her life." Christy tugged on Gary's sleeve. "Uncle Gary, I need to tell you something. It's important." "What is it, sweetheart?" She glanced nervously at Lorenzo, then whispered, "Can we talk privately? Like Mommy used to when she had secrets." Gary's pulse quickened. "Of course. Lorenzo, if you'll excuse us." "Actually, I should probably," Lorenzo began, but Gary cut him off. "We'll catch up later." He led Christy to a quiet area behind the chapel, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "What did you want to tell me?" Christy reached into her small purse, a miniature version of one Tamara used to carry, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The paper was stained with what appeared to be dried blood. "Mommy gave me this the night before she went to sleep forever. She said if anything happened to her, I should give it to you. But only to you, not to Lorenzo or anyone else." With trembling hands, Gary unfolded the note. Tamara's handwriting was shaky but legible. "Uncle, please check Mommy's tummy before it's too late." Christy saw Lorenzo gimme shots when he thought she was sleeping, under the bathroom sink, hidden behind the pipes. Evidence. Protect her. Trust no one else. The blood on the paper wasn't from an injury. It was from a fingertip, Tamara's final effort to leave DNA evidence that could connect her murder to Lorenzo. She'd managed to write this note and hide it with Christy even while dying from systematic poisoning. "Christy, when did Mommy give you this?" 2 nights ago, after Lorenzo left. She was very sick, but she made me promise to keep it secret until today. She said today would be safe because there would be lots of people around. Even in her final hours, Tamara had been thinking tactically, ensuring Christy would have witnesses present when she revealed the evidence. It was a level of strategic planning that suggested she'd understood the full scope of the danger they were facing. "Uncle Gary, what are shots?" Lorenzo said they were vitamins to help Mommy feel better, but she always looked worse after he gave them to her. The complete picture crystallized in Gary's mind. Lorenzo had been administering poison through injection, probably using insulin or another substance that would metabolize quickly and leave minimal forensic evidence. Christy had witnessed these treatments, but been told they were beneficial, creating psychological confusion that had prevented her from speaking up sooner. "Christy, you did exactly the right thing. Mommy would be very proud of you. Are we going to make Lorenzo go away now? Like the bad guys in my Lego castle?" The question was asked with such innocent hope that Gary had to pause before answering. Christy had built traps for imaginary villains in her toys, never knowing she'd be facing a real monster who'd killed her mother. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to make sure Lorenzo can never hurt anyone else ever again." Across the cemetery, Lorenzo was watching them with increasing agitation. He positioned himself near his BMW, ready for a quick escape if necessary. The man's body language suggested he understood that the conversation taking place was a threat to his carefully constructed narrative. Gary stood up, keeping Christy close to his side. We need to go back to Mommy's house right now. There's something important we need to find. The hiding place behind the pipes. That's right. And then we're going to make some phone calls to people who can help us. As they walked back toward the parking area, Lorenzo intercepted them. His friendly mask had slipped slightly, revealing the predator underneath. Everything all right? Christy looked upset about something. She's processing grief, Gary replied evenly. It's normal for children to have difficult emotions at funerals. Perhaps I should come with you. Children often respond better to familiar faces during traumatic times. That won't be necessary. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. I insist. As someone who cared for Tamara, I feel responsible for Christy's emotional well-being. The territorial language was deliberate. Lorenzo was asserting a claim to Christy that had no legal basis but served to test Gary's resolve. In his previous crimes, this was probably the point where grief-stricken relatives would acquiesce to his authority, grateful for any help with overwhelming responsibilities. And I feel responsible for keeping Christy safe from anyone who might harm her, Gary replied, letting steel enter his voice. We'll be fine on our own. For a moment, the two men stared at each other in silent confrontation. Lorenzo was evaluating whether his cover had been blown and calculating his options for damage control. Gary was memorizing every detail of the man's appearance and behavior for the hunt that was about to begin. Of course, Lorenzo said finally, his smile returning but failing to reach his eyes. I'll call you later to check on her. You do that. As Lorenzo drove away in his BMW, Gary noted the license plate number and committed it to memory. Then he lifted Christy into his truck and headed for Tamara's house, where the final pieces of evidence waited behind a bathroom sink. 20 minutes later, Jeff Loomis stood in Tamara's bathroom, photographing the collection of vials and syringes that Lorenzo had hidden behind the pipes. The hiding place was sophisticated, a waterproof container secured with magnetic strips that would be invisible to casual inspection, but easily accessible to someone who knew exactly where to look. Son of a bitch, Jeff muttered, examining the contents. Professional-grade insulin, potassium chloride, and something I don't recognize. This is enough to kill a dozen people if administered correctly. And the blood sample from the note? That'll give us DNA evidence that Tamara wrote it, plus we can test for whatever cocktail he was using. Combined with Christy's testimony about the injections and this cache of murder weapons, we've got enough for an arrest warrant. Christy sat in the living room, coloring in a new book Gary had bought her, seemingly oblivious to the investigation happening around her. But he caught her glancing toward the bathroom occasionally, as if she understood that the evidence they were collecting would determine whether justice was served for her mother. How long before you can move on him? Gary asked. Couple hours for the warrant, assuming the judge agrees this is solid evidence. But Gary, Jeff paused, studying his friend's expression. When we arrest this guy, you need to let the system handle it. No cowboy justice, no matter how much he deserves it. Of course not, Gary replied automatically. But even as he spoke the words, he was thinking about Sarah Martinez and Rebecca Chun, the other victims who'd never received justice. He was thinking about Christy, who'd have to live with the trauma of witnessing her mother's murder. He was thinking about whatever other children might be in Lorenzo's crosshairs if the legal system failed to stop him permanently. Jeff had been his friend for 20 years, but Jeff had never hunted human predators in environments where the rules of engagement were determined by survival rather than courtroom procedure. Some threats required solutions that existed outside the boundaries of legal justice. An hour later, as Jeff coordinated with the district attorney's office, Gary received a call from an unknown number. Hello, Gary. I think we need to have a conversation. Lorenzo. That's right. I imagine you've been busy this afternoon, playing detective with your police friend. Very thorough work, by the way. I'm impressed. Where are you? Somewhere safe. But more importantly, somewhere with a clear view of your house. Becky's home from her hospital shift, I see. Lovely woman. It would be unfortunate if she became collateral damage in whatever misguided crusade you're planning. The threat was delivered with casual efficiency, confirming that Lorenzo had been watching Gary's family for weeks or months. He'd probably surveilled everyone close to Tamara before making his move, identifying potential obstacles and pressure points for precisely this kind of situation. If you touch my wife, you'll what? Call the police? I'm already wanted for questioning, remember? At this point, I have nothing to lose by expanding my target list. What do you want? Simple. You're going to call off your investigation and convince your detective friend that the evidence was planted by a grieving relative who watched too many crime shows. In return, I disappear forever and your wife lives to see tomorrow. Gary looked toward the living room, where Christy was still coloring, unaware that her mother's killer was threatening the only family she had left. The little girl had already lost everything once. He couldn't let it happen again. I need time to think about this. You have 1 hour. After that, Becky's evening jog becomes much more dangerous. The line went dead, leaving Gary to contemplate the impossible choice Lorenzo had engineered. Accept injustice and let a child killer escape, or fight back and risk everything he cared about in the process. But as he watched Christy carefully color inside the lines of her book, he realized the choice wasn't impossible at all. It was exactly the kind of tactical problem he'd trained for in the army. When conventional rules didn't apply, you improvised new ones. Lorenzo Hughes had made his final mistake by threatening Becky Richardson. Now he was about to learn what happened when you declared war on a man with the skills and motivation to fight back without limitations. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. Chapter 4. The Predator's Web. Gary immediately called Becky at the hospital. I need you to stay there tonight. Don't come home, don't go anywhere alone, and don't trust anyone you don't know personally. Gary, what's happening? You sound terrified. Just promise me. Please. Okay, and call Jeff Loomis right now. Tell him to put a protection detail on you immediately. Use the code phrase umbrella weather. The code phrase was something he and Jeff had established years ago, a way to communicate that an active threat required immediate response without explanation. Becky would be safe at the hospital, surrounded by security cameras and personnel, while Jeff arranged official protection. With his wife secured, Gary turned his attention to Christy. The little girl looked up from her coloring book as he approached. Christy, we're going to play a special game, okay? Like hide and seek, but more important. Is it because of the bad man? Her intuitive understanding was both heartbreaking and useful. That's right. And just like in your Lego castle, we're going to set a trap for him. Will the trap work? Yes, sweetheart. It will work. Gary spent the next 30 minutes implementing security measures that would have impressed his old army unit. He activated the concealed camera system he'd installed throughout the house after David's death, ostensibly for Christy's protection during visits, but actually because his military experience had taught him that preparation was the difference between surviving and becoming a victim. The cameras were commercial grade, hidden in smoke detectors and electrical outlets, connected to a secure server that would automatically upload footage to a cloud storage system Jeff could access. If Lorenzo made good on his threats, every second would be documented with high-definition clarity. Next, he retrieved his personal arsenal from a gun safe that Christy had never seen opened. 3 handguns, 2 rifles, body armor, and enough ammunition for a small war. He wasn't planning to fight Lorenzo Hughes with conventional weapons, but preparation for multiple scenarios was fundamental to tactical success. Finally, he called his neighbor, Mrs. Ingram, an elderly woman who'd become Christy's unofficial grandmother since David's death. Therese, I need a favor. Can Christy stay with you tonight? There's a family emergency. Of course, dear. Should I be worried? Just keep your doors locked and call 911 if anyone you don't recognize tries to come inside. 30 minutes before Lorenzo's deadline, Gary delivered Christy to Mrs. Ingram with a hug and a promise that everything would be fine. Then he returned home to wait for a killer who thought he was dealing with a grieving amateur instead of a trained professional. At exactly 1 hour after their phone conversation, Lorenzo called back. Time's up, Gary. What's your decision? I'm willing to make a deal, but not over the phone. If you want to discuss terms, we meet face to face. Interesting. Most people in your situation prefer to negotiate from a distance. I'm not most people. No, you're not. Lorenzo's voice carried a new note of respect, mixed with curiosity. Very well. Cheeseman Park, near the pavilion. 1 hour. Come alone, and bring your detective friend's contact information so we can finalize our arrangement. Cheeseman Park was a smart choice. Multiple exit routes, limited cover for snipers, and enough open space to spot surveillance teams. Lorenzo had clearly done this before, probably multiple times. But he'd made one crucial error in his planning. He'd assumed Gary would follow conventional rules of engagement. Instead of driving to the park, Gary took his motorcycle, a black Kawasaki Ninja that was nearly silent when properly maintained. He arrived 45 minutes early and used the time to establish overwatch positions and identify potential ambush sites. Lorenzo would expect him to approach directly, but Gary had learned patience in environments where impatience meant death. At the appointed time, Lorenzo emerged from behind the pavilion wearing dark clothing and carrying what appeared to be a tablet computer. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd orchestrated similar confrontations before, scanning for threats, but focusing primarily on the main pathways into the park. He never looked up into the oak tree where Gary waited with night vision equipment and a clear shot at his target. "Gary, I know you're here. Let's get this over with." Instead of responding, Gary activated a portable speaker he'd placed near the playground equipment. His voice echoed from the wrong direction, forcing Lorenzo to turn away from his planned escape route. "First question, how many others have you killed?" "That's not relevant to our current negotiation." "It is to me." "Sarah Martinez, Rebecca Chun. How many others?" Lorenzo laughed, but it sounded forced. "You've done your homework, but you're missing the bigger picture. Enlighten me." "Some people pay very well for access to specific types of children. Children who've been properly conditioned through trauma and loss. My clients appreciate kids who are already broken, easier to control." The casual admission of child trafficking hit Gary like a physical blow. Lorenzo wasn't just a serial killer. He was part of a larger network that targeted vulnerable children for sale to predators. The murders were business expenses, removing protective parents who might interfere with the real product. How many children? Over the past 5 years? Maybe 30, though I only handle the preliminary conditioning. Other specialists manage the actual customer service. 30 children, 30 families destroyed so that sick customers could purchase access to traumatized kids. Gary's hands tightened on the rifle scope as he fought the urge to end this conversation with a single shot. Where are they now? Safe and sound with their new families. Well, most of them. Some of the younger ones have proven too fragile for the work, but that's not my department. And Christy? Christy would be very popular with my clients. Young enough to be malleable, old enough to be useful. Plus, she witnessed her mother's death, which creates a particular psychological profile that some customers specifically request. The predator was enjoying this conversation, reveling in the psychological torture he was inflicting on a man who cared about the child he was describing as merchandise. But Lorenzo had fundamentally misunderstood his opponent. Gary Richardson wasn't a grieving civilian struggling with moral complexity. He was a professional soldier who'd spent 8 years learning how to eliminate threats to innocent people. The only thing preventing him from pulling the trigger was the need to extract information about the broader network before terminating this particular node. "What happens if I refuse your offer?" "Becky dies first, obviously. Then Christy disappears into my network, where she'll spend the rest of her life servicing customers who appreciate young girls with her particular qualities. And you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that your stubborn pride cost them everything. And if I accept, you convince your detective friend that the evidence was planted, I disappear forever, and your family lives normal lives. Christy goes into foster care, where she'll be safe from people like me." It was a lie, of course. Lorenzo had already identified Christy as a valuable commodity. He wouldn't abandon that profit simply because Gary cooperated. The deal was designed to buy time for him to relocate his operation and arrange for Christie's eventual abduction through other channels. "I need something in return. Information about your clients, your network. If I'm going to let you disappear, I want to know who else to watch for." Now you're thinking like a professional. Lorenzo pulled out his tablet, accessing files that probably contained customer lists and organizational details. "I can give you enough information to protect your local area. Consider it professional courtesy." As Lorenzo focused on his tablet, Gary made his move. The oak tree was 30 feet from the pavilion, an easy drop for someone with paratrooper training. He landed silently behind his target, using a sleeper hold that rendered Lorenzo unconscious in less than 10 seconds. Professional restraint techniques followed: plastic zip ties for wrists and ankles, duct tape for the mouth, and a black hood to eliminate visual orientation. Then Gary loaded the unconscious predator into a panel van he'd parked behind the maintenance building. The same van he used for furniture deliveries, now repurposed for a very different kind of transport. Lorenzo Hughes had spent years perfecting the art of making people disappear. Now it was time for him to experience the process from a different perspective. The drive to Gary's workshop took 20 minutes through Denver's industrial district. The building was isolated, soundproof for power tools, and equipped with the kind of equipment that could handle any project requiring precision and creativity. When Lorenzo regained consciousness, he found himself secured to a heavy workbench in a windowless room lit by harsh fluorescent lights. His tablet lay open on a nearby table, displaying the customer files he'd been prepared to share as part of his fictional negotiation. "Good evening, Lorenzo. We're going to finish our conversation now." Lorenzo's eyes darted around the workshop, taking inventory of the situation. Saws, drills, sanders, and other tools that could serve multiple purposes. Soundproofing that would muffle any noise. Industrial ventilation that could remove evidence of whatever happened in this room. "You're making a mistake, Gary. This isn't who you are. You don't know who I am. I know you're not a killer. You're a craftsman, a builder. This kind of work requires a different set of skills. Fortunately, I have a diverse skill set." Gary activated the tablet, scrolling through customer files that contained more horror than he'd witnessed in 3 combat deployments. Names, addresses, specific requests for children with particular trauma profiles. Financial records showing payments in cryptocurrency for services rendered. Photos of previous victims, including several children who couldn't have been older than Christy. 37 clients, he said aloud, studying the data. 12 different cities. And you're just one node in the network. Killing me won't stop anything. There are dozens of recruiters working for the same organization. Cut off one head, 2 more take its place. Maybe, but cutting off your head will definitely stop you. For the first time since regaining consciousness, Lorenzo showed genuine fear. He'd probably threatened hundreds of victims with violence, using their terror as a tool of control and manipulation. Now he was experiencing that same helplessness from the other side. "Wait, we can make a real deal. I'll give you everything: client lists, organizational structure, financial records. Enough information to shut down the entire network. You'll give me that information anyway. But if you kill me, you become just another murderer." Is that what you want Christy to remember about the man who raised her? It was a skillful psychological attack designed to exploit Gary's protective instincts and moral framework. But Lorenzo had misunderstood the situation completely. Christy will remember that someone who threatened her family disappeared forever and never bothered anyone again. The details are irrelevant. Over the next 3 hours, Gary extracted every piece of information Lorenzo possessed about the trafficking network. Client names, organizational hierarchy, financial systems, recruitment methods, and the locations of facilities where children were held for conditioning. The process required skills he'd learned in military intelligence: how to verify information under stress, how to detect lies and misdirection, how to maintain psychological pressure without allowing emotion to compromise effectiveness. Lorenzo proved remarkably cooperative once he understood that his survival depended on complete honesty. At 3:47 a.m., Gary had everything he needed: customer lists that would allow law enforcement to rescue dozens of children and arrest their abusers, financial records that would expose the entire money trail, operational details that would shut down recruitment networks across multiple states. Lorenzo Hughes, child trafficker and serial killer, had served his final useful purpose. "Last question," Gary said, approaching the workbench with a cordless drill. "Any next of kin who should be notified? You don't have to do this. I gave you everything you wanted. You threatened my wife. You murdered my sister-in-law. You plan to sell my niece to pedophiles. Yes, I absolutely have to do this. The drill bit was designed for precise work. 3/8-inch carbide, sharp enough to penetrate bone and brain tissue with minimal resistance. One quick insertion behind the left ear, angled upward toward the brain stem, and Lorenzo Hughes would cease to exist. It was a technique Gary had learned from a Navy SEAL instructor during a joint training exercise in Afghanistan. Clean, quiet, and completely lethal. The kind of solution that was sometimes necessary when conventional justice wasn't sufficient to neutralize a threat. "Please," Lorenzo whispered. "I have information about other children. Kids who are still being held. If you kill me, they'll never be found. I have your files. I have your client lists. I have everything I need to find them. Not everything. There are off-book operations, private arrangements that aren't in the files. I'm the only one who knows about them." Gary paused, studying Lorenzo's face for signs of deception. The man was terrified, desperate, and probably willing to say anything to buy more time. But the possibility that additional children might be saved was worth investigating. "Tell me, there's a private client in Aspen. Ultra-wealthy, ultra-discreet. He has 4 children at his compound right now. Kids who were acquired through alternative channels. They're not in any database. Not connected to any official missing persons reports. Names. I don't know their real names. He prefers to rename them himself, part of the psychological conditioning. But they're all between 6 and 10 years old, all acquired within the past 2 years. The information was specific enough to be credible, and it aligned with patterns Gary had observed in the other files. Wealthy clients often maintained private facilities for long-term access to their victims, operating completely outside the normal trafficking networks. Address. Lorenzo provided detailed directions to a mansion in the mountains outside Aspen, along with security protocols and staff schedules. The compound was isolated, heavily secured, and designed to ensure that screams would never be heard by anyone who might investigate. "There," Lorenzo said desperately. "Now you have everything. Those 4 kids will die if you kill me, because no one else knows they exist." It was probably another lie, designed to buy time for escape or rescue. But Gary couldn't take the chance that 4 children might remain trapped with a predator because he'd prioritized personal revenge over tactical objectives. "You're going to call your contact in Aspen," Gary said finally. "You're going to tell him that law enforcement is investigating his operation and he needs to evacuate immediately. You're going to save those children's lives. And then you're going to disappear forever. Not into witness protection, not into a new identity. Permanently." Lorenzo made the call, his voice shaking as he warned the Aspen client about imminent law enforcement action. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but Gary could hear enough to confirm that an evacuation was being initiated immediately. 4 children would be abandoned during the evacuation, left behind to be found by authorities instead of continuing to serve as merchandise for a wealthy pedophile. It wasn't a perfect rescue, but it was better than leaving them to suffer indefinitely. "Thank you," Lorenzo whispered as Gary approached with the drill. "I know this doesn't change anything, but thank you for making me do that." "You're right. It doesn't change anything." The drill bit penetrated Lorenzo's skull at exactly 4:23 a.m., severing his brain stem and ending his life instantaneously. There was no suffering, no prolonged agony, just the quick, clinical termination of a threat that could never be allowed to harm another child. Gary Richardson had crossed a line that most people never approached, taking justice into his own hands when the legal system proved inadequate to protect innocent victims. But as he stood over Lorenzo's corpse, he felt no guilt or remorse, only the satisfaction of eliminating a predator who would never hunt again. The real work was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Network Unravels. At dawn, Gary began the methodical process of making Lorenzo Hughes disappear permanently. The workshop's industrial equipment, originally designed for woodworking, proved equally effective for corpse disposal. A wood chipper converted organic matter into particles small enough to be distributed across multiple waste sites without leaving identifiable remains. By 7 a.m., The only evidence that Lorenzo had ever existed was the tablet full of incriminating information and Gary's memories of their final conversation. The workshop had been cleaned with military precision, leaving no forensic traces that could connect the space to any criminal activity. Gary's phone buzzed with a text from Jeff. Lorenzo Hughes skipped town. No forwarding address. Paid his apartment rent through the end of the month in cash, and hasn't been seen since yesterday afternoon. We got APBs out, but this guy knows how to disappear. The official investigation would continue for months, eventually concluding that Lorenzo Hughes had fled the jurisdiction to avoid prosecution. His mysterious disappearance would be attributed to criminal sophistication rather than permanent termination by a trained soldier. But Gary's war against the trafficking network was far from over. Using Lorenzo's files and customer lists, he began mapping the entire organization. 37 clients spread across 12 states, each paying premium prices for access to traumatized children. 5 recruitment specialists like Lorenzo operating under different identities in different regions. 2 central processing facilities where children were held for conditioning before being delivered to customers. The scope was staggering. This wasn't a small-time local operation. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been destroying children's lives for years, while law enforcement remained completely unaware of its existence. At 9 a.m., Gary called Jeff with a carefully crafted story. I found something else in Tamara's house. Hidden documents that suggest Lorenzo was involved in something much bigger than just a murder. What kind of documents? Financial records, client communications, organizational charts. Jeff, this bastard was part of a child trafficking ring. A big one. The silence on the phone lasted nearly 30 seconds as Jeff processed the implications. Jesus Christ. How big? Dozens of clients, multiple states, and it looks like Tamara found out about it before she died. That's why he killed her. She was going to expose the whole network. Where are you getting this information? I'll bring everything to you this afternoon. But Jeff, some of these kids might still be alive. We need to move fast. 3 hours later, Jeff Loomis sat in Gary's kitchen, staring at printouts from Lorenzo's tablet with the expression of a man watching his worst nightmares become reality. Customer profiles detailed specific requests for children with particular trauma backgrounds. Financial records showed millions of dollars in cryptocurrency transactions. Organizational charts revealed a network that spanned half the country. Jeff paused, struggling for words. This is the biggest case I've ever seen. How the hell did local law enforcement miss something this massive? Because they were careful, Gary replied. They targeted families that were already isolated and vulnerable. Single mothers, children without extended family support systems, people who wouldn't be missed immediately if they disappeared. And you found all this in Tamara's house, hidden in her bedroom closet, inside a shoebox. She must have discovered it somehow and been collecting evidence before Lorenzo realized what she was doing. It was a carefully constructed lie, but one that would give law enforcement everything they needed to dismantle the network while protecting Gary from any connection to Lorenzo's disappearance. The evidence was real, only its discovery method had been fabricated. Jeff spent the next hour photographing documents and making phone calls to federal authorities. Within 6 hours, the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit had initiated Operation Broken Chain, a coordinated effort to arrest customers and rescue victims across multiple states. The first raids began at dawn the next day. Christopher Doherty, a software executive from Phoenix, was arrested at his home office while video chatting with 3 children who were being held at a facility in New Mexico. His computer contained terabytes of illegal imagery and detailed communications about specific services he'd purchased from the trafficking network. Benjamin Childs, a suburban Denver accountant, was taken into custody at his workplace. His home office contained a hidden room equipped with restraints and recording equipment, along with detailed journals documenting his interactions with purchased children over the past 3 years. Alejandro Caldwell, a high school principal from Colorado Springs, was arrested during a school board meeting. His personal vehicle contained photographs of students he'd been evaluating as potential recruits for the network, along with communication devices used to coordinate with Lorenzo Hughes. By the end of the first week, 26 customers have been arrested and 14 children have been rescued from various locations. The children ranged in age from 4 to 12, and many required immediate medical attention for physical and psychological trauma. But the raids also revealed that Lorenzo had been telling the truth about off-book operations. Several clients had maintained private facilities that weren't documented in the official files, and those children remained missing. The Aspen mansion Lorenzo had described was raided by federal agents, but they found it abandoned except for 4 children who'd been left behind during the evacuation. The kids were alive, but severely traumatized, unable to provide useful information about their captor's current location. Gary received regular updates from Jeff as the investigation progressed. Each arrest and rescue validated his decision to extract information from Lorenzo before eliminating him. But the incomplete nature of the network's destruction left him unsatisfied. 2 weeks after Lorenzo's disappearance, Gary was working in his shop when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Christie's school. "Mr. Richardson? This is Principal Martinez at Lakewood Elementary. I'm calling because Christie hasn't been picked up from school, and we can't reach Mrs. Ingram." Ice ran through Gary's veins. Mrs. Ingram had been caring for Christie while he focused on dismantling the trafficking network. The elderly woman was reliable, punctual, and would never leave Christie stranded without explanation. "I'll be right there," he said, already reaching for his keys. He arrived at the school to find Christie sitting in the principal's office, swinging her legs from an oversized chair. She looked calm, but concerned, the way children do when they sense adult anxiety without understanding its source. "Uncle Gary!" She ran to him for a hug. "Mrs. Ingram didn't come to get me. The school lady called her house, but nobody answered." Gary knelt to Christie's eye level, studying her face for signs of distress or trauma. "How was your day, sweetheart? Did anything unusual happen?" "A man came to my classroom during lunch. He said he was a new teacher, but he asked me lots of questions about you and Mommy." The blood drained from Gary's face. "What kind of questions?" "Where you work, where we live, if I had any other family." Miss Peterson came back, and the man left, but she looked worried. Principal Martinez appeared in the doorway, her expression grave. "Mr. Richardson, I tried to call you earlier about the incident, but it went straight to voicemail." The man who spoke with Christie presented credentials identifying him as a substitute teacher, but when we called the district office, they had no record of assigning anyone to our school today. Description: mid-40s, brown hair, average height. Professional dress, friendly demeanor. But something felt off about him, too interested in specific children rather than general classroom management. It sounded like a recruitment scout, someone tasked with identifying potential targets for the trafficking network. Lorenzo's death had created operational gaps that other members were trying to fill, and they'd identified Christie as a high-value opportunity. "Has anyone attempted to contact Mrs. Ingram?" "Police are conducting a welfare check at her house now. We called them after we couldn't reach her and heard about the unauthorized visitor." Gary's phone buzzed with a call from Jeff. "I'll take this outside," he told Principal Martinez. "Christie, stay right here with Mrs. Martinez, okay?" In the hallway, Jeff's voice was tense. "Therese Ingram is dead. Apparent heart attack, but the timing is suspicious. And Gary, her house has been searched. Professional job, looking for something specific." The network was fighting back. They'd killed an innocent elderly woman and were now actively targeting Christie. Lorenzo's death had escalated the conflict rather than ending it. "Jeff, I need protective custody for Christie. Immediately. Already in progress. I'm sending units to the school now." "But Gary, whoever these people are, they're playing for keeps. You and Becky need protection too." "Understood. Where do you want us?" "Safe house outside of town. We'll keep you there until we've rounded up the rest of the network." But Gary knew that conventional law enforcement wouldn't be sufficient to protect his family. The trafficking organization had demonstrated sophisticated capabilities and ruthless determination. They'd murdered Mrs. Ingram to send a message, and they wouldn't stop until Christie was in their custody or everyone protecting her was dead. As he returned to the principal's office to collect Christie, Gary Richardson made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. Running and hiding wasn't an option. not when dealing with predators who had unlimited resources and professional patience. The war that had begun with Lorenzo's elimination was escalating. And this time, Gary wouldn't be satisfied with destroying individual nodes of the network. He was going to burn the entire organization to the ground, starting with whoever had ordered the hit on Mrs. Ingram. The predators had made a critical error in threatening a 5-year-old girl who was under the protection of a man trained to fight wars against much more dangerous enemies. They were about to learn the difference between hunting vulnerable single mothers and targeting a professional soldier's family. Chapter 6: The Hunter Becomes Hunted. The FBI safe house was a nondescript ranch home in Littleton, Colorado, equipped with surveillance equipment and staffed by agents trained in witness protection. Christie seemed to view the relocation as an adventure, exploring the unfamiliar rooms with the curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to fear the world. But Gary recognized the tactical disadvantages immediately. The house had only 2 exit routes, limited sight lines, and was positioned in a suburban neighborhood where collateral damage was inevitable if the situation escalated. They were sitting ducks waiting for predators who'd already demonstrated their willingness to kill innocent bystanders. "This isn't going to work," he told Agent Daryl Peters, the lead investigator assigned to Christie's protection. "You're thinking like cops, not like soldiers. These people aren't going to announce themselves with a warrant. We have protocols for protecting high-value witnesses," Peters replied defensively. "This location has been used successfully for dozens of cases. How many of those cases involved organized child traffickers with military-grade resources and nothing left to lose?" Peters had no answer for that question because the FBI had never encountered an organization like the one they were fighting. Most trafficking cases involved street-level criminals with limited sophistication and predictable methods. This network operated like a professional intelligence service, complete with surveillance capabilities, elimination protocols, and backup systems for every operation. That evening, as Christie slept in the safe house's back bedroom, Gary received a call from an unknown number. "Good evening, Mr. Richardson. I believe we need to discuss your recent interference with our business operations." The voice was calm, educated, and carried the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders that were never questioned. This wasn't another recruiter like Lorenzo. This was management. "Who am I speaking with?" "Someone with the authority to resolve our current conflict through negotiation rather than escalation. You've caused significant operational disruption over the past 3 weeks, but we're prepared to offer a mutually beneficial arrangement." "I'm listening." "You return the files you stole from our associate, cease all cooperation with law enforcement, and relocate to a different state with your family. In return, we write off your interference as a grieving relative's emotional response and make no further moves against your people." And Christie, the child represents valuable inventory that was acquired through considerable investment. She remains part of our operation. The casual reference to Christie as inventory made Gary's vision go red for a moment. These people didn't see children as human beings. They were commodities to be processed and sold like any other product. "Counteroffer," Gary said, his voice deadly calm. "You release every child in your custody, surrender all customer lists and operational files to law enforcement, and disappear forever. In return, I don't hunt down every member of your organization and eliminate them individually." Silence stretched across the phone line for nearly 30 seconds. When the voice returned, it carried a new edge of respect mixed with threat. "You're more interesting than our initial assessment suggested. Most people in your situation focus on protecting their immediate family rather than making grand gestures about justice. Most people haven't seen what I've seen. Afghanistan, wasn't it? 3 tours, Army Rangers decorated for valor under fire. Yes, we've done our research since Lorenzo went missing. Impressive military record, but that was foreign combat against conventional enemies. This is domestic operations against people who understand your weaknesses better than you do." The implicit threat was clear. They'd been studying his background, identifying pressure points and vulnerabilities. But they'd made the same mistake Lorenzo had made, assuming that conventional leverage would work against someone trained to operate in unconventional environments. What weaknesses would those be? Your wife works at Denver General Hospital. 12-hour shifts, usually alone in parking structures when she arrives and leaves. Your workshop is isolated, perfect for accidents involving industrial equipment. And Christy, well, children are remarkably easy to acquire when proper planning is applied. Each threat was delivered with clinical precision, designed to demonstrate their reach and capabilities. But rather than intimidating Gary, the conversation was providing valuable intelligence about their operational methods and psychological profile. "You seem to have me at a disadvantage," he said, encouraging them to reveal more information. "We prefer overwhelming tactical superiority to fair fights. It's more efficient and produces better results. When do you want an answer to your offer?" 48 hours. After that, we begin implementing alternative solutions to our current problem. The line went dead, leaving Gary to contemplate the chess match that was about to begin. The trafficking organization had resources, connections, and professional patience. But they'd also revealed their primary weakness. They thought like business people rather than warriors. In business, threats and negotiations were tools for managing risk and maximizing profit. In war, those same approaches were vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood the difference between survival and success. Gary spent the rest of the evening studying the organizational charts from Lorenzo's files, mapping relationships, and identifying critical nodes in the network structure. 37 customers, 5 recruiters, 2 processing facilities, and at least 1 management level that coordinated operations across multiple states. Conventional law enforcement would spend months building cases against individual members, hoping to pressure low-level operators into revealing higher-level connections. But that approach allowed leadership time to relocate assets and eliminate evidence while innocent children remained in captivity. A direct action approach would be faster and more effective. Identify leadership, eliminate their ability to coordinate operations, and force rapid decisions that would expose the entire network. At 3 a.m., Gary quietly left the safe house through a bedroom window, avoiding the FBI surveillance team that was focused on external threats rather than witness departure. He'd left detailed notes for Agent Peters explaining his actions and providing backup copies of all files related to the trafficking network. Christy would be safer in FBI custody than traveling with him during what was about to become active combat operations. But she needed to understand that her Uncle Gary hadn't abandoned her, and that everything he was about to do was aimed at ensuring she'd never have to fear these people again. He drove through the night to his workshop, where equipment and supplies waited for the kind of operation the Army had trained him to conduct. Urban warfare against asymmetric threats in populated areas with high collateral damage potential. By dawn, Gary Richardson had transformed from a grieving craftsman into the hunter he'd been trained to be in Afghanistan. The trafficking network had declared war on his family, assuming they were dealing with a desperate civilian who could be intimidated into submission. They were about to learn why the 75th Ranger Regiment had the motto, "Rangers lead the way." And they were about to discover what happened when someone trained to eliminate terrorist cells decided to apply those skills against predators who bought and sold children. The hunting season had officially begun. His first target was Benjamin Childs, the Denver accountant whose arrest had provided a wealth of financial information about the network's operations. According to Jeff's updates, Childs had been released on bail pending trial, a tactical error by the justice system that created an opportunity for direct action. Childs lived in a suburban neighborhood that was perfect for surveillance and infiltration. Multiple access routes, predictable neighbor schedules, and enough ambient noise to mask any operations that might become necessary. Gary spent 18 hours studying Childs' routine before making his move. The accountant worked from home 3 days per week, ordered takeout food delivery twice weekly, and maintained a private office in his basement where illegal activities had been conducted. More importantly, Childs had been making phone calls to numbers that weren't in Lorenzo's files, evidence that backup communication networks existed for high-value customers who needed to relocate their operations after law enforcement attention. At 2 a.m. on Tuesday morning, Gary entered Childs' house through a basement window that had been left unsecured. The home security system was sophisticated but not military-grade, easily bypassed by someone with training in facility penetration. He found Childs asleep in a master bedroom, exhausted from legal proceedings and stress related to his arrest. The man woke to find a figure in black tactical gear sitting in a chair beside his bed, holding a suppressed pistol that was aimed at his chest. "Good morning, Benjamin. We need to discuss your business relationships." Child's attempt to reach for a panic button was interrupted by a zip-tie restraint system that rendered him immobile in less than 10 seconds. Professional-grade interrogation techniques followed, psychological pressure designed to extract information quickly without leaving forensic evidence. Within 30 minutes, Gary had phone numbers for 2 additional management-level contacts, financial information for offshore accounts containing millions in trafficking proceeds, and detailed descriptions of operational protocols used by the network security teams. Most importantly, Childs confirmed that leadership had ordered Christie's immediate acquisition regardless of law enforcement attention. The little girl wasn't just valuable inventory. She was the bait being used to force Gary into a tactical position where they could eliminate him along with the files he'd obtained from Lorenzo. "Where are they planning to grab her?" Gary asked, applying pressure to Child's wrist in a way that created excruciating pain without permanent damage. "I don't know the specifics," Childs gasped. "Security teams handle operational details. I just provide financial services." "Who gives orders to the security teams?" "A man named Gordon O'Neill. He's based in Salt Lake City, manages all enforcement operations for the Western region." Gordon O'Neill, a name that hadn't appeared in Lorenzo's files, confirming that multiple layers of the organization remained hidden from law enforcement. O'Neill was the tactical coordinator responsible for eliminating threats to network operations. "How do I contact O'Neill?" "You don't. He contacts you when necessary." "But," Childs hesitated, calculating whether cooperation might improve his survival prospects. "There's a scheduled conference call tomorrow night. Regional coordinators discussing the situation with your family." "What kind of discussion?" "Damage assessment and elimination protocols. How to minimize operational exposure while resolving the current threat." Gary extracted the conference call details, including access codes and security protocols. Tomorrow night, he'd have direct access to the leadership meeting where decisions about Christie's fate were being made. "Final question, Benjamin. Are you going to continue providing financial services to child traffickers?" "I know. I'm done with all of it. The legal trouble, the stress. I just want out." "Good answer." The suppressed pistol produced a sound like a heavy book dropping on a carpeted floor. Benjamin Childs died instantly, his financial expertise no longer available to fund the trafficking network's operations. Gary spent another hour in the house, downloading computer files and locating physical documents that provided additional intelligence about the organization's structure. Then he staged the scene to look like a suicide motivated by legal pressure and social disgrace. Law enforcement would find a man who apparently couldn't face the shame of his criminal exposure. They'd also find a detailed confession and additional evidence that would accelerate the investigation into the trafficking network. But most importantly, they wouldn't find any trace of Gary Richardson's visit. By dawn, the first phase of his counteroffensive was complete. One node of the network had been permanently eliminated, and he'd gained access to tomorrow's leadership meeting where tactical decisions about his family were being discussed. Gordon O'Neill and his colleagues were about to discover that their assessment of Gary Richardson had been catastrophically inadequate. They weren't dealing with a grieving civilian who could be intimidated into compliance. They were dealing with a professional soldier who decided to apply counterterrorism tactics against an organization that trafficked children for profit. And they were about to learn why that had been a fatal miscalculation. Chapter 7. The War Council. The conference call was scheduled for 9 p.m. Mountain Time, connecting regional coordinators across the trafficking network for a strategy session about resolving operational security concerns. Gary spent the day preparing for what would essentially be electronic reconnaissance of enemy leadership. Using Benjamin Childs' access codes, he established connection protocols that would allow him to monitor the call while remaining undetected. Military-grade signal processing equipment borrowed from his Army contacts ensured that his presence on the line would be invisible to standard telecommunication security. At exactly 9 p.m., 5 voices connected to the encrypted conference call. Gordon O'Neill from Salt Lake City, regional security coordinator responsible for eliminating threats to network operations. Stuart Joyce from Phoenix, recruitment specialist who'd taken over Lorenzo's territory after his disappearance. Frankie Keller from Las Vegas, logistics coordinator responsible for moving children between facilities and customers. Renee O'Connor from Denver, local operative tasked with Christie's acquisition and Gary's elimination. And a fifth voice that identified itself only as control, someone with authority over all regional operations. Situation report, Control said without preamble. Current status of the Richardson problem. Target family is in FBI protective custody, O'Neill reported. Safe house location has been identified, but federal surveillance makes direct action problematic. Collateral damage would create significant law enforcement attention. Alternative approaches? 3 options, Renee O'Connor interjected. First, we eliminate the primary target during a staged escape attempt from federal custody. Second, we acquire the child during transport between locations. Third, we force Richardson into a tactical position where elimination appears to be self-defense. The casual discussion of murdering a 5-year-old girl and her protective family was delivered with the same emotional tone used for discussing quarterly sales figures. These people had moved so far beyond normal human empathy that children were literally spreadsheet entries in their operational planning. Resource requirements for each option. Control asked. Option 1 requires corrupted federal personnel, O'Neill replied. We have 2 assets in regional FBI offices, but activation would expose them for future operations. Option 2 needs sophisticated coordination during transport, high risk of failure. Option 3 offers best cost-benefit ratio. Explain Option 3. Richardson has military training and protective instincts, O'Connor said. If we create a credible threat to the child, he'll abandon federal protection to conduct direct action against our operations. Once he's isolated from law enforcement support, we can eliminate him and claim self-defense against an unstable veteran. Timeline: 72 hours. We've identified his emotional pressure points and tactical preferences. Manipulation should be straightforward. Gary listened with professional detachment as they discussed strategies for killing him and abducting Christie. The conversation provided valuable intelligence about their capabilities, resources, and decision-making processes. But more importantly, it revealed their fundamental weakness. They were planning to manipulate him into doing exactly what he was already planning to do. What about the stolen files? Control asked. Secondary priority, Gordon O'Neill replied. Richardson has shared everything with federal authorities anyway. Our primary concern is eliminating him before he can identify additional network assets or conduct independent operations against our personnel. Has he demonstrated independent operational capability? Negative. Benjamin Child's suicide yesterday appears to be unrelated to Richardson's activities. Most likely stress-induced breakdown due to legal proceedings. They hadn't connected Child's death to Gary's actions, which meant his cover as a grieving amateur was still intact. The leadership team was planning to manipulate someone they thought was emotionally unstable rather than tactically sophisticated. Very well, Control said. Implement Option 3. Full authorization for necessary resources and personnel. Resolution required within 1 week. Understood, O'Neill confirmed. What's our backup plan if Richardson proves more resilient than anticipated? There is no backup plan. This situation represents an existential threat to our operations. Failure to resolve it will result in organizational restructuring that none of you would survive. The implicit threat was clear, success was mandatory, and failure would be met with elimination. Control was applying the same pressure to his subordinates that they routinely used against their victims, creating desperation that would lead to tactical errors. After the call ended, Gary sat in his workshop analyzing what he'd learned. 5 names, 3 facilities locations, and confirmation that they had corrupted personnel within federal law enforcement. More importantly, he learned that they were planning to force him into exactly the kind of direct action operation he was already preparing to conduct. But they'd made a critical miscalculation in their psychological assessment. They thought they were manipulating a desperate civilian into making emotional decisions that would expose him to elimination. Instead, they were about to face a professional soldier who'd spent 8 years learning how to destroy enemy networks using precisely the tactics they were trying to provoke. The next morning, Gary called Agent Peters with a carefully crafted request. "I need to speak with Christy. She's been asking for me, and I'm concerned about the psychological impact of separation." "We can arrange a supervised visit at the safe house," Peters replied. "But you'll need to follow strict security protocols. Actually, I was hoping we could meet somewhere neutral. Christy has some favorite places around town that might help her feel more comfortable discussing her feelings about recent events." It was a reasonable request from a concerned guardian, and Peters agreed to arrange a supervised outing to Sloan's Lake Park the following afternoon. The location was perfect for Gary's purposes: multiple access routes, limited federal surveillance capabilities, and enough open space to identify potential threats before they became tactical problems. What Peters didn't know was that Gary had spent the previous night surveilling the park and identifying optimal positions for what was about to become the final confrontation with Gordon O'Neill's security team. The trafficking network was planning to create a credible threat to Christie that would force Gary into independent action against their operations. They were correct about his likely response, but completely wrong about his capabilities and preparation level. Tomorrow afternoon, Gordon O'Neill and his team would attempt to kidnap a 5-year-old girl under federal protection. Instead, they would encounter a professional soldier who'd spent 3 days planning their destruction using skills acquired during multiple combat deployments. The predators had been hunting vulnerable families for years, perfecting techniques for intimidation and elimination. But they'd never encountered someone who hunted predators for a living. They were about to learn the difference. That evening, as Gary finalized his preparations, he received an unexpected call from Jeff Loomis. "We've got a problem," Jeff said without preamble. Federal surveillance picked up chatter about potential action against Christie tomorrow. "Someone's planning to make a move during your supervised visit." "What kind of action?" "Unclear, but enough to make the FBI nervous. They're considering canceling the outing and moving you to a more secure location." "Don't let them do that," Gary said immediately. "If we keep running, these people will never stop hunting Christie. Better to deal with the threat in a controlled environment where we have tactical advantage." "Gary, you're not thinking like a civilian anymore. You're talking like someone planning a military operation." "Maybe because that's what this has become." Jeff was silent for several seconds. "You've been doing more than just hiding in safe houses, haven't you? Benjamin Child's suicide, Lorenzo Hughes' disappearance. There's more to both of those situations than official reports indicate. Sometimes the legal system isn't sufficient to protect innocent people from predators." "Jesus Christ, Gary. Tell me you haven't been conducting vigilante operations." "I've been protecting my family using the skills the Army taught me. Nothing more, nothing less." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get." "But Jeff, tomorrow is going to be dangerous. Make sure federal agents understand that they're dealing with professional criminals who've been planning this operation for weeks. Standard law enforcement tactics won't be sufficient." "What are you not telling me?" "I'm telling you to trust me and be ready for anything. These people aren't going to surrender peacefully when cornered." After ending the call, Gary spent the night writing letters to Christy and Becky, messages to be delivered in case tomorrow's operation didn't go according to plan. He'd survived 3 combat deployments, but domestic operations carried different risks and complications. If Gordon O'Neill's team proved more capable than anticipated, at least his family would understand that everything he'd done was aimed at protecting them from predators who viewed children as commodities to be bought and sold. But if his planning and preparation proved superior to their resources and tactics, tomorrow would mark the end of the trafficking network's threat to innocent families. Either way, The war that had begun with Lorenzo Hughes' elimination was about to reach its conclusion at Sloan's Lake Park. Chapter 8. The Final Hunt. Sloan's Lake Park on a Thursday afternoon looked like a postcard of suburban tranquility. Families walked along paved paths, children played on playground equipment, and joggers circled the lake's perimeter with rhythmic determination. Nothing suggested that the peaceful scene was about to become a battlefield between federal agents and professional criminals. Gary arrived early, positioning himself with clear sight lines to monitor approach routes while maintaining the appearance of a casual visitor. His military training automatically cataloged tactical details: wind direction, ambient noise levels, civilian concentration points, and potential cover positions for both friendly and hostile forces. Agent Peters and his FBI team had established discreet surveillance positions around the park, but their focus was on conventional law enforcement protocols rather than military-style assault tactics. They were prepared to arrest suspects, not to engage in combat with enemies who viewed federal agents as acceptable casualties. At 2 p.m., Christie arrived with her FBI escort, wearing a bright yellow jacket that made her easy to identify from a distance. She ran toward Gary with the enthusiasm of a child who'd been separated from family, unaware that her presence was bait in a trap designed to eliminate the last obstacle to her abduction. "Uncle Gary." She hugged him tightly, then stepped back to study his face with the perception children often possess. "You look different, like when Daddy was worried about important things." "I'm just thinking about how to keep you safe, sweetheart, from the bad men who hurt Mommy." The directness of her question was startling. Christie understood more about their situation than any 5-year-old should have to comprehend. But her awareness might prove tactically valuable if the situation deteriorated rapidly. "That's right. But you don't need to be scared because I'm going to make sure they can't hurt anyone ever again." They walked toward the playground area, where Christie could enjoy normal childhood activities while Gary maintained surveillance of potential threat vectors. For 20 minutes, everything appeared routine. An uncle and niece spending quality time together while federal agents provided discreet protection. Then Gary spotted the first anomaly: a man in jogging clothes who'd passed their position 3 times in 15 minutes, displaying none of the fatigue or rhythm associated with actual running. The figure was conducting reconnaissance, establishing sight lines, and timing patterns for an operation that was about to commence. 2 minutes later, he identified a second observer, a woman pushing a stroller that contained monitoring equipment rather than child. Her movement pattern suggested she was coordinating communications between multiple team members positioned around the park. Gordon O'Neill's team was implementing a sophisticated surveillance net designed to track Gary's movements and identify optimal windows for Christie's acquisition. But they'd made a critical error in their operational planning. They were treating this as a law enforcement scenario rather than a military engagement. At 2:47 p.m., Gary's radio crackled with Agent Peters' voice. "Possible hostiles moving into position. Count 4 vehicles. Estimated 8 personnel. Professional coordination. Recommend immediate evacuation to secure location." "Negative," Gary replied calmly. "Let them come." "What?" "Christie, we're going to play a new game now. Remember how you build traps in your Lego castle?" She nodded, suddenly alert to the change in his tone and demeanor. "I need you to go sit by that big tree over there and stay very quiet, no matter what happens. Can you do that for me?" "Are the bad men here?" "Yes, sweetheart. But remember what I promised? I'm going to make sure they can't hurt anyone ever again." Christie ran toward the designated tree, a massive oak that would provide both cover and clear sight lines for federal sniper support. Gary had selected the position during his preliminary reconnaissance, knowing that any confrontation would require civilian protection as the primary tactical consideration. At 2:51 p.m., the attack began. 2 vehicles approached from opposite directions, their occupants moving with the coordinated precision of professional security contractors. 4 men emerged from each vehicle, carrying concealed weapons and displaying tactical awareness that confirmed Gary's assessment of their capabilities. But they'd walked into a killing field that had been prepared by someone with superior training and more comprehensive planning. Agent Peters and his FBI team immediately moved to establish perimeter security, but their positioning was defensive rather than offensive. They were trying to protect witnesses rather than eliminate threats, which created tactical disadvantages against enemies who had no constraints on civilian casualties. Gordon O'Neill himself led the primary assault team, approaching Gary's position with the confidence of someone who'd conducted similar operations dozens of times. His methodology was textbook hostage acquisition, overwhelming force applied rapidly to prevent target resistance or law enforcement intervention. What he encountered instead was a former Army Ranger who'd spent 3 days preparing for exactly this scenario. "Mr. Richardson," O'Neill called out as his team established surrounding positions. "We need to discuss your recent interference with our business operations." "I'm listening," Gary replied, his voice carrying across the open space with military command authority. "You're going to walk away from this park and never contact law enforcement about our activities again. In return, the child comes with us, but suffers no immediate harm. Counteroffer: you and your team surrender to federal authorities, and I don't demonstrate what I learned about eliminating enemy positions during 3 combat deployments." O'Neill laughed, but sounded forced. "You're outnumbered 8-1, Mr. Richardson. This isn't Afghanistan, and we're not untrained insurgents hiding in caves. You're right. This is much easier." The first explosion came from beneath O'Neill's lead vehicle, a shaped charge that Gary had positioned during his preliminary surveillance. The blast disabled the engine and trapped 2 team members inside, while also providing the distraction necessary for federal snipers to acquire targets on the remaining hostiles. The second explosion eliminated the backup vehicle and confirmed that O'Neill's retreat options had been eliminated. Military demolitions training applied to urban warfare scenarios, using commercial construction materials to create precision effects without extensive collateral damage. "Jesus Christ," Agent Peters' voice crackled over the radio. "How did you focus on apprehending survivors?" Gary interrupted. "I'll handle the primary target." O'Neill and his remaining team members found themselves trapped in an open area with federal agents closing from multiple directions and a target who just demonstrated comprehensive tactical planning that exceeded their own capabilities. Their professional confidence evaporated as they realized they were outgunned and outmaneuvered by someone with superior training. "This is over, O'Neill," Gary called out, moving to flank the security team's defensive position. "Surrender now, and you might survive long enough to stand trial." "We have resources you can't imagine," O'Neill replied, desperation beginning to show in his voice. "This network spans multiple countries. Eliminating one regional team won't stop the organization." "Maybe not, but it'll stop you." The firefight that followed lasted less than 3 minutes. O'Neill's team was competent, but they were private security contractors who'd grown accustomed to intimidating civilians rather than engaging military-trained opponents. They'd brought urban warfare tactics to a confrontation with someone who'd perfected those same techniques against much more dangerous enemies. When the shooting stopped, 6 of O'Neill's 8 team members were dead or critically wounded. The 2 survivors were in FBI custody, providing detailed information about network operations in exchange for reduced sentences. Gordon O'Neill himself lay motionless beside the lake, eliminated by precision rifle fire from someone who'd qualified expert marksman during every year of military service. Christie emerged from behind the oak tree as federal agents secured the scene, running toward Gary with the resilience that children somehow manage to maintain even after witnessing violence. She'd been protected from the worst of the confrontation, but she understood that the bad men who'd threatened her family would never be a problem again. "Is it over?" she asked, taking his hand as they walked away from the battlefield. "Yes, sweetheart, it's over." Agent Peters approached with an expression that mixed relief with professional concern. "We're going to need detailed debriefings about your tactical preparations for this operation." "Of course. But first, I need to make sure Christie gets proper psychological support for processing what she's witnessed." "And the explosives? The tactical planning?" "This level of operational sophistication doesn't develop overnight. I learned skills in the Army that proved useful for protecting my family from predators. Nothing more complicated than that." Peters studied Gary's face, clearly suspecting that the official story was incomplete. But the results spoke for themselves. A child trafficking network had been dismantled, dozens of victims had been rescued, and the threat to Christy Richardson had been permanently eliminated. The survivors are providing intelligence about additional network assets, Peters said finally. This case is going to expand into multiple jurisdictions, probably require years of investigation to fully resolve. As long as Christy is safe, that's all that matters to me. As federal agents continued processing the crime scene, Gary walked with Christy toward the parking area where Becky waited with tears in her eyes and relief written across her face. The war that had begun with Tamara's murder was finally over, and their family could begin the long process of healing from trauma that no child should ever have to experience. But Gary knew that other predators existed in other cities, targeting other vulnerable families with the same methodical cruelty that had destroyed his sister-in-law's life. The skills he'd used to protect Christy could be applied to protect other children whose families lacked the resources to fight back against organized criminals. The trafficking network was broken, but the war against predators who bought and sold children would continue as long as such monsters existed in the world. For now, though, Christy Richardson was safe. And that was enough. Chapter 9. Justice Served. 6 months after the confrontation at Sloan's Lake Park, Gary Richardson sat in a federal courthouse, listening to prosecutors present evidence that would send the surviving members of the trafficking network to prison for the rest of their lives. The investigation that had begun with Lorenzo Hughes' disappearance had expanded to include law enforcement agencies in 12 states and had resulted in the rescue of 47 children from various forms of captivity. Christy sat beside him, now 6 years old, and attending counseling sessions that were helping her process the trauma of losing her mother and witnessing violence that no child should ever see. She'd adapted with the resilience that children possess, but Gary knew the scars would remain for the rest of her life. "Uncle Gary," she whispered during a court recess, "are all the bad men going to jail now?" "The ones who are still alive, yes. They'll never hurt any other children." "What about the ones who aren't still alive?" The question was asked with a directness that characterized Christy's approach to difficult topics. She understood that some of the people who'd threatened her family were dead, and she wanted confirmation that justice had been served. "They can't hurt anyone anymore either, sweetheart." "Good. Mommy would be happy about that." The simple statement encapsulated everything Gary had been fighting for, ensuring that Tamara's daughter could grow up without fear of the predators who destroyed their family. Whatever else happened in the legal proceedings, that mission had been accomplished. Agent Peters approached during the lunch break, his expression carrying professional satisfaction mixed with personal relief. Final count: 37 customers arrested, 5 recruitment specialists in custody or confirmed deceased, and 2 processing facilities shut down permanently. This is the largest child trafficking bust in FBI history. What about the management level? The people giving orders to Gordon O'Neill? 3 arrests in Salt Lake City, Phoenix, and Las Vegas. The individual identified as control turned out to be a woman named Sandy Andrews, operating out of a legitimate business consulting firm that provided cover for network coordination. She's looking at life without parole on RICO charges. The systematic dismantling of the trafficking network had exceeded even Gary's expectations. Law enforcement agencies had used the intelligence he'd provided to trace connections across state lines, identify financial networks, and locate facilities that had been operating for years without detection. And the children? 47 rescued, ranging in age from 4 to 14. Most are being reunited with surviving family members or placed with relatives who can provide proper care. Psychological support is being coordinated through federal victim services programs. It was a better outcome than Gary had dared hope for when he'd first decided to investigate Lorenzo Hughes. Dozens of children who'd been trapped in unimaginable horror were now safe, and the predators who'd bought and sold them were facing justice that matched the scope of their crimes. That evening, as they returned home to Lakewood, Christy asked the question that Gary had been dreading. "Uncle Gary, are you and Aunt Becky going to adopt me? Like, make it official so I don't have to worry about it anymore?" The legal proceedings for Christie's guardianship had been complicated by the circumstances of Tamara's death and the ongoing criminal investigation. But federal authorities had expedited the process in recognition of the family's sacrifice and Christie's need for stability. Yes, sweetheart, the papers will be finalized next week. You'll officially be Christy Richardson, and you'll be our daughter forever. Will I still remember Mommy and Daddy? Of course. We'll make sure you always remember them, and we'll tell you stories about how much they loved you. Will you teach me how to catch bad guys like you did? The question caught Gary off guard. Christie's experience with predators had given her a sophisticated understanding of good and evil that most children never developed. But she was also asking whether she could learn to protect other people the way he'd protected her. Maybe when you're older, we can talk about different ways to help people who are in danger, like being a police officer, or a social worker, or a prosecutor, or any number of other jobs that involve protecting children from people who want to hurt them. It was a conversation they'd have many times over the years as Christy grew up and decided what kind of person she wanted to become. But Gary suspected that her early experience with predators would influence her to choose a career focused on protecting other vulnerable people. 2 weeks later, Jeff Loomis stopped by the workshop where Gary was completing a custom dining set for a client in Cherry Hills Village. The furniture business had provided perfect cover for his operations against the trafficking network, but now it could return to its original purpose of creating beautiful pieces that would last for generations. Final report from the Bureau, Jeff said, dropping a thick folder on the workbench. Officially, the Richardson case is closed. Lorenzo Hughes is still listed as a fugitive, but the investigation has been suspended due to lack of leads. Unofficially, I think you did what needed to be done when the legal system wasn't sufficient to protect your family. But I also think there are aspects of this case that I'm better off not knowing about. Jeff had been asking fewer questions over the past 6 months, accepting that some situations required solutions that existed outside the boundaries of conventional law enforcement. His friendship with Gary was more important than satisfying professional curiosity about operational details. Is there anything else I should know about the network? Any loose ends that might resurface later? The financial investigation traced funds to accounts in 12 countries. Most have been frozen or seized, effectively cutting off revenue streams that funded operations. Without money, the organizational structure collapses pretty quickly. And the customers who weren't arrested? Ongoing investigations in multiple jurisdictions. This case provided enough intelligence to keep federal task forces busy for years. But the immediate threat to your family has been eliminated permanently. It was as much closure as they were likely to get. The trafficking network had been destroyed, the children had been rescued, and Christy was safe to grow up in a world where the monsters who targeted her could never harm her again. That night, as Christy slept in her new bedroom in the house that was now officially her home, Gary stood on the back porch looking up at the Colorado sky and thinking about the road that had led them to this point. 18 months ago, he'd been a simple craftsman building furniture and living a quiet life with his wife. Then predators had targeted his family, and he'd been forced to remember skills that the Army had taught him for dealing with threats to innocent people. The legal system had played its part, arresting survivors and prosecuting cases that would prevent future victims. But the decisive action had come from direct confrontation with enemies who understood only violence and power. Lorenzo Hughes, Benjamin Childs, Gordon O'Neill, and their associates were dead or imprisoned, never again able to harm children or destroy families. 47 children had been rescued from captivity and returned to people who would protect them. And Christy Richardson was safe to grow up with the love and security that every child deserved. It wasn't the kind of justice that appeared in law textbooks or courtroom proceedings, but it was effective, permanent, and proportional to the crimes that had been committed against innocent victims. Behind him, the house was quiet except for the normal sounds of the family settling down for the night. Becky was reading in the bedroom, probably still processing the trauma of the past year and adjusting to their new role as Christy's parents. Christy was sleeping with the security that came from knowing that the adults in her life would protect her from any threat. Tomorrow, Gary would return to his workshop and continue building furniture that would last for generations. Christy would go to school and play with friends and slowly heal from the psychological wounds inflicted by people who'd viewed her as merchandise to be bought and sold. But if other predators ever threatened his family or any other innocent children, Gary Richardson would be ready to remind them why the 75th Ranger Regiment's motto was Rangers Lead the Way. Some threats required solutions that existed outside the boundaries of conventional justice. And some people were uniquely qualified to provide those solutions when the legal system proved inadequate to protect the innocent from the monsters who walked among us. The war against the trafficking network was over. But the mission to protect vulnerable children would continue for as long as predators existed in the world. Christy Richardson was safe, and that ultimately was all that mattered. The end. Author's note: this story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual events or persons is purely coincidental. The themes of justice, family protection, and the fight against human trafficking reflect real-world issues that affect thousands of children and families worldwide. While the specific events in this narrative are fictional, the courage and determination displayed by those who protect innocent victims from predators is very real and deserving of our respect and support. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.